Walter, for honoring with your beautiful voice the talent of such a giant. You know, Topol brought so many Jews closer to traditions, and so many non-Jews were able to understand who we are through his art. You know, I'm teaching a class to future rabbis. It's called Rabbinical Practice. So I always try to finish the class with an anecdote about rabbinic life. When you're a student at the Seminario Rabbinico in the Jewish Theological Seminary, I guess in HUC too, one of the rituals that you have to go through before you can graduate is the senior sermon. Claudia, do you have it? Rabbi Botnik? Rabbi Kogan, you too? Yes. So you have to write the sermon, deliver it, and it's being criticized by your teachers and by your classmates first, and then give it in the seminary synagogue, correct? Now, this happens decades ago, so that meant that you had to stand up and speak in the presence of some of the great scholars of the Jewish world. And this happens in the JTS. So can you imagine how intimidated you were when you had to give a sermon in the presence of Louis Finkelstein, Alois Ginsberg, Sol Lieberman, Abraham Yeshua Heschel, Shalom Spigen, Gershon Cohen, Hillel Babli, H.L. Ginsberg? It happened to you, Rabbi Botnik? Yes. They were there when you spoke? Yes. So some of the other giants who sat in the row. So if you could survive that experience, if you could stand and preach to some of the most learned and sophisticated Jewish scholars in the world, you will never feel frightened at having to speak before a congregation again. So I have a teacher whose name I won't reveal, who told me the following story. For some reason, he himself doesn't know why he chose to make his senior sermon an attack on the philosophy of Dr. Abraham Yeshua Heschel. And somehow, I don't understand how, his homiletics professor and his classmates didn't stop him. And then halfway to the sermon, he said to himself, my God, what am I doing? You need to understand that Abraham Yeshua Heschel is the philosopher of the moment. First of all, he says, I'm taking advantage of the pulpit to shame a person who cannot talk back. And second, I am presuming to criticize a scholar whose learning is many, many times greater than mine. What on earth possessed me to do this? It was too late to change his sermon at this point. And so he somehow got through it, wishing all the time that the earth beneath his feet would open up so that he could escape. When the sermon was over, he counted the minutes until the end of the service, and as soon as it was over, he headed for the door as fast as he could. All he wanted was to get out of there, so embarrassed did he feel. But before he could reach the door, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was Dr. Heschel. He expected the worst. Would Dr. Heschel rebuke him for having done such a terrible thing? Would he humiliate him even more by rebuking him for his chutzpah? Instead, Dr. Abraham Yeshua Heschel said to him, some rabbis, when they talk to shoemakers, talk about the sins of tailors. And when they talk to tailors, they talk about the sins of shoemakers. You, I know now, will someday be a great rabbi, because when you talk to tailors, you talk about the sins of tailors. And when you talk to shoemakers, you talk about the sin of shoemakers. And he hugged him. The two of them became very good friends for the rest of Dr. Heschel's life. You remember that Dr. Heschel is the one that ordained Rabbi Marshall Meyer, and he's the one that ordained us. So you were obligated to read all of Heschel books in the seminario. I'm not saying I understood them. I'm just saying we used to read them. So Had Dr. Heschel rebuked him or ignored him or humiliated him, they would never have had anything to do with each other ever again. But because he thanked him for preaching to him so honestly, he won him over and saved this young rabbinical student's self-respect and his dignity, and made a friend for him for life. I'm always deeply moved by this story, every time I think of it, for two reasons. I'm moved by the spirit of Dr. Heschel, who could take criticism from a young student so well. And I'm moved by that, what he said, that the task of a rabbi is not to tell people what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. How different that is from the way most leaders speak today. The politicians all have managers who convene what they call focus groups, or who they try out their positions. If the focus group reacts favorably, then the politician espouses this position. If the focus group reacts negatively, then the politician avoids taking this stand. Our leaders have become followers of the public opinions polls. They say what the polls tell them the people want to hear. Instead of being leaders, they are followers, echoing the opinions of the people instead of trying to form them. Most of our leaders criticize shoemakers and praise tailors when they talk to tailors, and criticize tailors and praise shoemakers when they talk to shoemakers. And now, with this as a background, let me show you a passage in this week's Torah reading. A passage that shows how a real leader speaks and acts. Moses comes down the mountain and sees the Israelites dancing around the golden calf. Whose fault is it? When he speaks to Aaron, he says, "What did these people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" When he speaks to Aaron, he blames Aaron. And then when he speaks to the people, he says, "Alas, this people is guilty of a great sin in making for themselves a god of gold." When he speaks to the people, he blames the people. That is what an honest leader does. He does not try to curry favor with anyone by flattering them or by excusing their wrongdoings. Instead, he tells them the truth, whatever it is, what they want to hear or not. Let me tell you one more story about Dr. Heschel, which demonstrates the same quality. Back in 1953, he received by coincidence 2 speaking engagements. One was to address the Reformed rabbis at the convention in Colorado. The other was to address the conservative rabbis at the convention in New Jersey. He prepared 2 speeches. To the Reformed rabbis who stressed the spirit of the law over the letter of the law, he gave a talk on how Jewish law is indispensable to Judaism. He talked about how the spirit of the law, separated from the letter of the law, is a ghost, a dismembered spirit. To the Reformed rabbis, he spoke about how there can be no authentic Judaism without observance. You can imagine how that talk was received. It went against everything that this rabbi stood for, and so, to put it mildly, he got a very hostile reception. Weeks later, he spoke to the conservative rabbis. These are people who are committed to the law, who take halacha seriously. And so to them, he gave a talk that said that the mere observance is meaningless, that halacha without agadah, that law without faith, has no point, that merely carrying out the rituals without a sense of kavanah, intention, without the yearning spirit, has no point. You can imagine the kind of response that he received that day from rabbis to whom the law was central. So the greatness of Dr. Heschel was that when he rose to speak on both occasions, he had both talks in his hands. Had he switched them, he would have been warmly cheered in both places. The temptation to do so, the temptation to tell people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear, must have been very great. But he resisted it. He chose to tell the Reformed rabbis that there can be no meaningful Judaism without the law, and to tell the conservative rabbis that law by itself, without intention, has no meaning. What Dr. Heschel said to the young rabbi who criticized him in the seminary is what he himself did. When he spoke to shoemakers, he spoke about the sin of shoemakers. And when he spoke to tailors, he spoke about the sins of tailors. That was his greatness. Perhaps he learned it from Moses in this week's Torah portion. Moses, who could have commiserated with Aaron and blamed the people when he spoke to him, who could have commiserated with the people and put the blame on Aaron when he spoke to them, but who instead courageously and honestly confronted them both, Aaron and the people, and made them face up to what they had done wrong. There is a lesson here that I wish our leaders here and in Israel could learn. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they would put away their managers and their controllers and put away the focus groups and their public opinion surveys and speak the truth that is in their hearts instead? Then they would be real leaders and not just politicians. Then they would be fit to lead the people instead of being parrots who only echo what they think the people want to hear. A politician who behaved this way might not get elected, but at least he would not have sold his soul in the process of winning some votes. May our leaders here and there keep this truth in mind. Shabbat Shalom. Please rise for Aleinu 166. Aleinu.